Welcome to this explainer. We often think of democracy as this sort of finished product, right? Like a static system that a country either has or it doesn't. But the reality is actually way more dynamic than that. Democracy is a constant, ongoing evolution. It's continuously being shaped by the struggles, the hurdles, and the reforms of its citizens. So in this explainer, we're going to map out exactly how democracies evolve, the major structural hurdles they face all over the globe, and most importantly, how we actually fix them. Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the promise of democracy, then break down the three core challenges. From there, we'll take a quick global tour, set some guidelines for political reform, look at real-world proposals, and finally, talk about the citizen's role. Section 1, the promise of democracy. There's this really widespread illusion out there that once a country holds a free election, bam, the work is done. But think about it. Does democracy actually have any real rivals left in the contemporary world? Well, the short answer is no. As our sources confirm, democracy is absolutely the dominant form of government today. It doesn't face any serious global ideological challenger. But, and this is a massive but, the promise of democracy is still far from realized anywhere in the world. Because having no challenger, that is definitely not the same thing as having no challenges. And that actually brings us to how we need to define those hurdles. We aren't just looking at dead-end problems here. A challenge is a difficulty that carries within it an incredible opportunity for progress. It's a structural test. Once we overcome it, our political system is literally elevated to a higher level than it was before. So keep this positive cognitive contrast in mind as we go. We are looking at opportunities for structural progress. Section 2, 3 core challenges. So, democracies don't all experience the exact same struggles at once. It's more like they face distinct evolutionary stages. First up, we have the foundational challenge. Next is the challenge of expansion. And finally, the challenge of deepening. And these stages build right on top of each other. I mean, you can't expand democratic rights if you don't even have a foundational democracy to begin with, right? Let's break down exactly what each of these means. First is the foundational challenge. Get this, according to our source data, at least 1/4 of the globe is still not under a democratic government. For these nations, the challenge is pretty stark. It's about making that initial transition, bringing down non-democratic regimes, keeping the military entirely out of government control, and just establishing a functional sovereign state. This brilliant cartoon perfectly captures that foundational struggle. Notice how the military figure is literally using a high-powered weapon as a telescope to search for democracy. It completely hits the nail on the head. It shows how in regions facing these foundational challenges, military power and force completely overshadow and distort the entire democratic vision. Now, once that foundation is actually built, we hit the challenge of expansion. This applies to established democracies, places like India and the United States. It's all about applying basic democratic principles across all regions, social groups, and institutions. So we're talking about ensuring greater power for local governments, bringing women and minority groups fully into the fold, and making sure that fewer and fewer decisions are made outside of democratic control. Finally, we reach the challenge of deepening. And honestly, every single democracy faces this in some form or another. This is about strengthening institutions and practices so people can actually realize their everyday expectations of democracy. Crucially, it requires a really concerted attempt to bring down the control and influence of the rich and powerful when it comes to governmental decision-making. It's about making absolutely sure the system answers to the people and not just the elite. Section 3, democracy around the world. Okay, let's take our theoretical framework and map it out in the real world. In Mexico, even after defeating the dominant party back in 2000, they faced a real deepening challenge with serious allegations of election rigging. China and Saudi Arabia, they face major foundational challenges with political monopolies and the exclusion of women from public activities, respectively. Pakistan struggled heavily with fraud allegations during military-led referendums. And even the United States faced intense democratic scrutiny when the UN called the Guantanamo Bay detentions a direct violation of international law. So as you can see, no nation is exempt from these structural tests. Section 4, guidelines for political reform. Finding the challenges is only half the battle, right? How do we actually solve them? Well, it is incredibly tempting to just pass a law, banning whatever it is we don't like in politics. But our sources urge us to resist this. The text uses a really great analogy. Constitutional changes are like the rules of cricket. A rule change might reduce some negative tactics, sure, but the actual quality of the game, that relies on the players and the coaches. In the exact same way, democratic reforms rely on the players, the political activists, the citizens, the media. The main focus must always be on increasing political participation, not just slapping on restrictive laws. Let's look at two totally different approaches. In some states, candidates with more than 2 children were flat out banned from local panchayat elections. And the result? It unintentionally denied democratic opportunities to so many poor citizens and to women. Counterproductive, right? Now contrast that with the Right to Information Act. Instead of banning something, it actually empowers citizens to find out exactly what the government is doing so they can act as watchdogs. Empowering laws almost always succeed where restrictive bans fail. Section 5. Real-world reform proposals. Let's apply this empowerment philosophy to a real-world scenario. First, a really specific micro-level civic challenge in Uttar Pradesh. A survey found that doctors posted to rural primary health centers were simply absent. They were living in towns, running private practices while the villagers suffered. So how do you reform this? Should the government mandate compulsory living in the village and threaten to fire them? Should the police conduct surprise raids? Or, aligning with our empowerment philosophy, should the local village panchayat be given the power to write the doctor's annual report? Placing that oversight directly in the hands of the participating citizens often yields the most sustainable results. Next up, let's zoom out to a massive, macro-level deepening challenge. This striking cartoon from our source material shows a dollar bill unrolling like a red carpet straight up to the doors of the White House. It is such a powerful visual metaphor for the immense, oversized role of money in politics today. The overarching problem here is that wealthy candidates and big business donations absolutely dominate the political landscape, and that essentially reduces the voice of the poor. So what are the proposed reforms? Well, solutions include making all political party financial accounts totally public for government auditing, or implementing state funding where the government actually covers election expenditures. Another idea is encouraging tax-exempt donations directly from ordinary citizens. The ultimate goal here is to design a system that dilutes the power of extreme wealth and amplifies the voice of the everyday voter. Section 6. The citizen's role. Look, we can talk about laws and institutions all day long, but ultimately, the human element is what makes or breaks a democracy. Our source text features this fascinating dialogue between a pretty cynical student named Rose and her teacher, Madame Lindo. Rose just assumes all politicians are terrible and that getting rid of them will solve everything. But Madame Lindo points out a really hard truth. She says the corruption of the politician is more visible, and we get the impression that all politicians are corrupt. She challenges that lazy assumption that just replacing politicians magically fixes the system. Because actually, politicians simply reflect the society they come from, a society filled with the exact same contractors, officials, and professionals who also struggle with corruption. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful takeaway from their conversation. You cannot have democracy in a real sense unless people and politicians overcome the barriers of caste and religion. There are already laws on the books banning the appeal to caste and religion in politics, but guess what? Politicians still find ways to bypass them. Laws achieve absolutely nothing unless citizens actively resist attempts to be divided and misled. The ultimate reform isn't a constitutional amendment at all. It's an alert, vigilant, and unified citizenry. And that leaves us with our final thought for today. We've seen that democracy is absolutely not a spectator sport. It's a constant, structural challenge that demands your participation. We've looked at the global hurdles, the failure of simple bans, and the vital necessity of citizen empowerment. So I'll leave you with this. How will you act as a watchdog of your own democracy? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and I hope this deep dive into the mechanics of our political systems leaves you fired up and eager to stay engaged.